For more than a century, law enforcement has been using forensic science to solve crimes and bring offenders to justice through a variety of evolving methods. From the time of England's Scotland Yard and Sherlock Holmes to modern-day criminal investigations, law enforcement constantly seeks more accurate ways to locate and identify suspects of criminal activity. In the book titled The Birth and Development of the DNA Theory of Inheritance, 60 Years Since the Discovery of the Structure of DNA, Francis Crick shook the world in 1953 by making a simple statement: "We have discovered the secret of life." Evidence has never been the same since. Forensic evidence such as DNA and fingerprints have been employed by law enforcement for the past 100 years as a scientific tool to link crimes to offenders. I've chosen to inform you about DNA and fingerprints to educate you in the differences and benefits of the two sources of evidence. Today, I'm going to tell you about the history of the uses of DNA and fingerprints as evidence, as well as the pros and cons between the two. First, a brief history of the discovery and uses of DNA and fingerprints as evidence. According to the book India and the Discovery of Fingerprints, fingerprints were first used in the 1860s by William James Herschel in the Bengal province of India. The classification system that would eventually serve as the basis for the identification of individual people was developed by Bengal Police Inspector General Edward Richard Henry between 1891 and 1901. Henry was able to use a system of fingerprint classification to match duplicate fingerprints, or the known fingerprints of one person with fingerprints evaluated at a different time, thereby positively identifying the contributor of the fingerprints. The first known court case to use fingerprints to identify a suspect was in England in 1902, when Harry Jackson was tried and convicted for burglary. DNA was first discovered by German scientist Friedrich Miescher in 1865 as a chemical substance. But it was not until 1944 when Oswald Avery found that it was actually genetic material. In 1953, Francis Clark and James Watson discovered the double helix of DNA and made significant steps toward the identification of the unique genetic material contained within. Advances in DNA profiling were made over the next 30 years. Then in Leicester, England, in 1986, Richard Buckland was exonerated in a sexual assault case that he had actually admitted to, and subsequently identified and convicted Colin Pitchfork for the crime in 1987, as found on the DNA Wikipedia page. Next, DNA and fingerprint evidence has helped provide investigative leads and solve many cases. According to the FBI, the National DNA Index, or NDIS, has over 13 million profiles. About 500,000 of those profiles do not match any known offenders or arrestees and are considered unknown offenders. As of May 2014, the Combined DNA Identification System, or CODIS, has provided over 245,000 hits and has assisted investigators in almost as many cases. In Georgia alone, there are 277,935 offender profiles, 15,063 unknown offender profiles, and CODIS has assisted investigators in 5,066 cases. It is unknown exactly how many of those cases have been solved throughout the country, as many cases are still pending or have no known offender. The FBI reports about 75.9 million individuals have fingerprints in the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System as of November 2013. The database contains over 500,000 sex offenders' fingerprints. Statistical data was not provided regarding investigative leads for fingerprints. Finally, pros and cons of DNA and fingerprint evidence. DNA is contained within each living cell. DNA can be transferred to any surface with little more than a touch of a finger, leaving skin cells behind, or the shedding eyelash falling onto the floor. DNA is found in saliva, body fluids, blood, and body tissues. Identical twins have identical DNA. Therefore, if an offender is found to have a twin, DNA evidence loses credibility. DNA results have a margin of error because all human beings have similar genetic markers. For instance, a DNA result may indicate a 1 in 8 billion probability that the DNA belongs to an individual. There are about 6 billion human beings on the planet. Therefore, there is always going to be a margin of error. Fingerprints are unique to each individual. Even identical twins do not have the same fingerprints. Ridges, grooves, patterns, all make up the fingerprint itself. Fingerprints, however, can be smudged or not readable on certain surfaces. Therefore, the fingerprint evidence is actually not as efficient as the DNA evidence, although it is unique to each individual. So today I told you about the history and the uses of DNA and fingerprints as evidence, as well as the pros and cons between the two. I hope you've been educated in the differences and benefits of the two sources of evidence, DNA and fingerprints. And as you can see, DNA and fingerprints have been employed by law enforcement for the past 100 years as a scientific tool to link crimes to offenders. So when Francis Crick said, "We have discovered the secret of life," he probably didn't realize that it would actually be used as evidence later on down the road. But his discovery was significant nonetheless.